Hello, my favorite carboholics. It's Henry with Henry's Bread Kitchen. Thanks for being here. Today we're doing a bread called ciabatta. It's an Italian bread. It was invented in the year 1982 by an Italian baker, and then some guys from New York brought them over to try to make this bread here, and it was still evolving. And now it's a huge bread in the United States, all over Europe. This is a very, very difficult bread to make if you're a beginner because it's so wet. But the methods that we use here will help you with other wet doughs, like baguettes or anything else that's really wet. So ciabatta in Italian means slipper, because that's the way it's going to look when you're done with it. It's going to be a long, elongated bread with a crispy crust, but light, with unusually large holes in the middle. And the bread itself is very, very soft and gentle. So it's an interesting bread to make. It's a delicious bread to make. And it's one you can have fun with flour. You can put flour all over the place, as long as you don't get it in the recipe. And we'll talk about that. All right, so let's begin. We begin with making a poolish the night before. Now, if I'm being honest and giving it its proper accolade, it's really a biga because it comes from Italy. So you may have heard me talk about this before, but a poolish, a biga, a sponge, a starter are all variations on the same thing, basically the same thing. So we've put some yeast in here, tiny little bit, with equal amounts of flour and water that come from our recipe. That's important to remember. And you can do this with any bread. You can take any bread you're making and take a portion of the water and a portion of the flour that are equal to each other, add a tiny amount of yeast, if it's yeast bread, of course, and then mix that together until there's no loose flour. It should be really like pancake batter, and then leave that on your counter, or better still, in your refrigerator on the top shelf. It'll slow the process down, and you'll develop more flavor. You'll develop more, you have a better crust, more elasticity. It's just amazing, and you'll taste the difference. And you can leave it in the refrigerator for up to 2-3 days to continue to do that. Understand that the longer you leave it in the refrigerator, the more the lactic acid is produced, and it'll become a more tangy, more sourdoughy, sour tasting bread. A lot of people like that. In our kitchen, we bake southern sourdough, which means that we allow the yeast to dominate over the bacteria in our starter, as opposed to the bacteria dominating over the yeast. When your starter rises and you catch it right at the top of that rise, that's when you really should bake with it. If you let it fall or begin to fall, your starter or your poolish or your biga, then you're going to have more lactic acid produced by the bacteria. So anyway, we started our biga, poolish, last night. And I went ahead and did it in the bowl that I'm going to mix it in. One of the tricks that we want to learn is if you do your poolish, biga, or sponge in a container, then we want to add the water to that container to help make this really easy to come out. Otherwise, you're scraping in here and you're carrying on. So we're going to add what's left of our water. We started out with 440 grams of water in our recipe, and we've used 200 grams of it in here. So all we have left to do is to add our 240 grams of water that remain. And that's what this is. That'll help separate that. And then we're going to add the rest of our flour, which is we started out with 550 grams. We've used 200 of it, so we've got 350 grams left to add. Now, I always say, measure these things out in another bowl so you don't, that's important. Measure it in another bowl and then add it to your mixing bowl, because this is your final product and you don't want to go over. I've been doing this a while. This will jinx me. So I'm going to go straight into the bowl with 350 grams of bread flour. I use King Arthur bread flour because it's just consistent, and I know that I'm going to get the same thing every time. You need a bread flour here instead of a little bit of all-purpose might not hurt you, but what we're trying to form are large gluten strands that can withstand all of the yeast exhalations, which is the CO2 the yeast give off. We need a strong gluten network in order to hold those air bubbles in, because this is a really holy bread at the end. When you look inside, you've got large holes, and the only way that can really happen is so that if the gluten sufficiently covers the yeast exhalations or the CO2 that's given off by the yeast to make that happen. If you have a less gluten development, or you're under kneading the bread, then that air CO2 will escape and you'll have a flatter bread. So we've added our flour, we've added our additional water. Now we've got to put in our salt, which is, if you're using table salt, it's only 1 teaspoon. If you're using kosher salt, then you're going to go up to 1.5 teaspoons. And that's because different salts are shaped differently. Table salt are tiny little cubes that fit together pretty well, tightly, and you only need a teaspoon of it. Kosher salt are big salt crystals. So in order to get the same weight, you're going to have to use more than what a teaspoon is, because it all won't fit in a teaspoon. All right? Table salt, kosher salt, sea salt, pink Malayan, whatever, all that stuff. Hey, listen, if it's salt, then you're okay. Everything else is just because, you want to do it, and that's fine. So I've got all of my ingredients in my stand mixer, and they've all been weighed out properly with a scale. Now listen, if you've heard me talk about this, if you don't have a scale, you need to get one, because my measurement of a cup of flour and your measurement of a cup of flour are two different things. Do you shake it to make it even? Do you pack it? Do you leave a little rounding on the end of it? The recipe says 550 grams of flour because that's what it takes, not 540, not 557. So in order to make your breads consistent, you need a scale. Otherwise you'll say, well, I made this before and it didn't turn out like this, or how did it turn out so nice? That's easily determined. You knock out a lot of the variables when you know you have a scale. So I'm gonna use a paddle attachment on this, and I'm gonna mix it for 1 minute on the paddle attachment on low speed. Okay, that's been 1 minute on first speed. Now we're going to go for an additional minute on the next speed, 2. You should be easily able to see how the gluten strands are coming together right now. We want to beat this until it begins to pull away from the walls of the bowl. So we're starting off slow, building up some gluten structure so we're not tearing it so much. Once it gets a little stronger, then we increase the speed, because the dough can handle it after we've begun to develop this gluten network. Okay, that's been a minute on the second speed, and I want to stop here and I want to show you what it should look like so that you're not alarmed. This is your bread dough. Can everybody see that? It's starting to have some elasticity, and it's really wet. Now, you see how it tears a little? as it hangs, some of it sticks together, some of it tears. That's because the gluten's not strong enough yet. But we will be after this mix, because this is a 4-minute mix on, it's called an intensive mix on speed number 3. I love this. I just love it. All right, look at that. It's all picked away from the sides of the bowl. And it's almost all of it is on this, and that should come away pretty easily. So I'm going to use my dough scraper, wet my hands a little. Just fold it into the middle. Now we've got 4 turns to do on this, and they're going to last every 30 minutes. Well, actually every 45 minutes we're going to do it. So take some cling film, put over this guy, and let it sit. Alexa, set my timer for 45 minutes.
45 minutes, starting now.
Okay, so it's been 45 minutes, and we've had a chance for this to sit and ferment and to develop some strength. And we're going to do a fold. Now, this can